Thanks so much for joining us here on KGW+. I'm Stephanie Domurat. Now we're bringing you a special report after a court hearing ended just a few hours ago in a lawsuit brought by the state of Oregon to block the Trump administration from deploying National Guard troops in Portland. KGW's Iboshi was in that hearing this morning. He's joining us now to talk the very latest in this. Now first, where do things stand right now?
Right, so this was a hearing over a temporary restraining order. So essentially the state of Oregon wanted to stop the Trump administration from deploying federal troops in Oregon. President Trump had ordered the deployment of roughly 200 Oregon National Guard troops in Oregon. The state is saying, wait, let's put the brakes on this, and essentially doing so with a temporary restraining order. Both sides were in court today. They both argued their case. Judge Karen Immergut asked a lot of questions of both sides and then said, listen, I'm going to take this under consideration, do some additional reading, make a decision either later this evening or tomorrow.
So we are waiting to hear when that decision will be. As you mentioned, it could be any minute, it could be any day.
Right, and I should note too, sorry to interrupt,
No, it's okay.
that decision will be posted on the government's court website. So really everybody at this point is kind of watching and waiting and refreshing, hoping to see when that announcement is made, because they're not going to call everybody back in court. Instead, it'll just be posted on the court website.
Let's back up a bit. Give us a brief timeline of how we got here. I mean, it starts months ago.
It does. There have been ongoing protests outside the ICE facility in Portland, that's in South Portland, where occasionally we've seen some clashes between demonstrators and federal agents. There have been some arrests during that time period. Much of that activity occurred earlier in the summer months. Since then, it's been relatively quiet. We have seen sporadic demonstrations, some clashes with federal officers, yes, and there have been some recent arrests. Now, how significant or severe those are, that's kind of a point of contention here as far as what's being reflected from the government and the Trump administration, and also from the state of Oregon and also people who live in that area as far as what's truly happening here. Is this a narrative or is this reality, right? So based on that, largely, President Trump has made a number of disparaging remarks about the conditions in Portland, generally speaking. Then he issued an order saying, I want to deploy the Oregon National Guard over the objections of the governor. So typically, it's the governor who says, we want to deploy the National Guard, typically for natural disasters. So this is floods, this is wildfires. During the pandemic, for instance, they were called to help out medical and hospitals during those time periods. So that's when they're
disasters.
Exactly,
yes.
They're called into action. And again, the governor is typically the one that says, we shall do this. In this case, though, it was the president. And
we did see some back and forth, right, from the governor to President Trump saying, we don't need you here, all is good here, things are very different, as you mentioned, from us Portlanders and those who live in Oregon than maybe what the president is seeing from wherever he's getting his sources.
Right, and we should note that we don't know when troops would be on the ground in Portland. That really is the big question. What we've been told and was reflected in court today is that those troops are training. According to Senator Jeff Merkley, they're training at Camp Riley near Warrenton. They'll be there for several days to work on crowd control and use of force training. Then, as it's been suggested, they will be deployed to Portland to protect federal buildings, and that will be the limitation of what they'll be doing. That is kind of the big question as well, is like, where will the general public see the Oregon National Guard? Other questions, will they be armed? What type of equipment will they have? Less than lethal. What specifically will they be asked to do to protect these buildings? And will we see them anywhere else? So there really are a lot of unanswered questions. We should also note that early on, a lot of the answers were coming from the Oregon Military Department, which is normal, a state agency or a state level. Now that's no longer the case. Instead, the state is referring all questions to the Department of Defense, which is overseeing this through the U.S. Army's Western Command.
I want to ask now specifically, what were the major arguments that we heard from both sides in this hearing today?
Right, so without getting too deep in the weeds, which is very easy to do, essentially the state is saying, listen, we need to put a pause here because what the federal government is trying to do is unlawful and it's unnecessary. So it's unlawful because the president doesn't have the right to deploy troops in the state of Oregon. This is something the governor has the right to do. Again, this is according to the feds. They point very specifically to the fact that the feds say federalization is justified by an inability to exercise the laws of the United States. So essentially they're saying at the ICE facility, federal workers can't do their job. And therefore, we need the National Guard to help come in and protect that building so that they can do their job. As far as unnecessary, the state says, listen, we don't need the feds here. Portland police have the situation under control. And during that court hearing today, they talked about some of the communication between Portland police and those protecting the ICE building, federal agents. So there is some level of, I won't say coordination, but there is communication going on. And we've heard and seen from Portland police that's doing some enforcement action outside that building to keep people calm. They have made arrests, Portland police specifically, around that area. And in hearing from Portland Police Chief Bob Day earlier this week, he very specifically says we do not need the National Guard. He made that very clear. So as far as the state is concerned, again, it is unlawful that they're doing this, and it is unnecessary. Therefore, they're asking the judge to stop the deployment of the National Guard through a temporary restraining order, which would pause this. Something else I need to point out, though, there's also a lawsuit, right?
Right.
So if this temporary restraining order is granted, the lawsuit itself would continue, right? It would just kind of put the brakes on things, as we said. The other side of this, right? The government. So the Trump administration and Department of Justice was in court today. Their attorneys argued, listen, it is lawful. They claim the president does have the right to do this. Secondarily, they say it is necessary. They claim police do not have the situation under control. They say that federal agents are taxed, that multiple sub-agencies under Homeland Security have sent agents here from elsewhere around the country, 100 or so agents, and that's necessary to protect this building. A building they claim has been attacked, vandalized, officers have been injured, they've been doxxed. So the Trump administration's lawyers went to great lengths to say, listen, this is an ongoing issue that is certainly not under control, and local authorities haven't done enough to handle it. Therefore, we need the National Guard to come in.
And so the big question will be where that discretion lies with the judge, right? Does local law enforcement, state, oversight have things under control enough that they don't need to send in additional troops? That's really the argument here, right? What is the definition of under control and kind of safety? Right,
Yeah,
that the judge is deciding?
and really fundamentally, and this gets pretty deep in the weeds legally, is are they lawfully allowed? Is the federal government lawfully allowed to deploy the National Guard in the state of Oregon, right? And it does become this challenge between federal and state, and who's making this decision. One thing that was fairly interesting during today's court hearing is some of the interaction between the judge, Karen Immerget, and the attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice. In some ways, one could note that he almost got off on the wrong foot with the judge, and he was describing and quoting President Trump's posts on Truth Social, describing the conditions in Portland. And at one point, the judge interrupted and said, really, social media, you want me to base my decision on whether to issue a temporary restraining order in this case, stopping the deployment of federal troops based on social media? And that really was an interesting interaction right out of the gate, that a lot of people kind of stepped back and said, wow, she really is asking some tough questions of the federal government and really questioning whether the federalization of troops is necessary. And we don't know what to read into the judge's statements, questions in this case, because it really was interesting how things played out. Unlike what we would normally see in a civil or criminal trial where different sides make their arguments and then there's cross-examination, this was a situation where all sides assembled in court, then Judge Immerget asked questions of both sides, just kind of freely, back and forth. Then she provided time for both sides to make their arguments in what were really kind of prepared remarks, if you will. But as an observer in that courtroom, it was a fascinating 2-hour hearing. Not all federal hearings are that exciting. This one was really very, very compelling. And we should note, unfortunately, cameras are not allowed in federal court. So the best we can do is kind of describe what happened in court. You oftentimes see court proceedings in state court, and that's because cameras are allowed with the judge's permission. In federal court, unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to have cameras there. But this is one that I wish the general public had the opportunity to see and hear, because the arguments from both sides were very compelling, and the judge was very engaging, and it was 2 hours of, I won't say courtroom drama, but really, really interesting study in law.
I want to ask you more about the judge. Of course, she was changed last minute because the previous judge was changed because they wanted to avoid any conflict of interest in this case. So, what do we know about her? And you mentioned something that stood out, but did anything else stand out in her exchanges with the attorneys?
First, her background you see there. You may recognize the name Karen Immergut. She was a former U.S. attorney in Oregon, served for 10 years as a judge in Multnomah County, and then was appointed to the federal bench in 2019. She came into this really at the 11th hour because Judge Michael Simon was assigned to this case, and it was a random draw. He was assigned to this case. The Trump administration yesterday filed a motion for recusal, basically saying he should be removed from the case because his wife is Oregon Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, who's been an outspoken critic of the Trump administration's deployment of federal troops in Oregon. In fact, she spoke at a press conference over the weekend, and they pointed specifically to that fact and noted a number of statements she made during that press conference on the waterfront. Several hours after that motion was filed, there was notice given to the public that this case would be reassigned to Judge Immergut. I should note, recusals are not really that unusual, but in this case, it happened swiftly, and then it moved on to Judge Immergut. Read into it what you want, but there's no question now of any conflict of interest since they moved it on to Judge Immergut.
So big picture, looking ahead, we are awaiting Judge Immergut's decision here. But either way, this is part of a bigger picture and a longer, basically, potentially trial at some point, right? So give us kind of a timeline of what we could see, whether she says, okay, I deny the restraining order, I allow the troops, to move forward.
Sure.
What could happen then?
Sure. So the big question now is whether she will grant the temporary restraining order. And essentially, this can come in many different ways, but in all likelihood, if Judge Immergut were to grant the temporary restraining order, that would pause the deployment of troops. And in talking with the National Guard, they can bring people back, no problem. These are people that live in the state of Oregon. So it's something logistically that can happen fairly easily. If that temporary restraining order is not granted, then it's kind of business as usual, and the deployment continues, and we don't know when we would see troops on the ground. So two different options here. They're kind of basically stay or go. But there is a lawsuit, as you mentioned, an underlying lawsuit under this. And this is Oregon v. Trump. This is basically the state of Oregon saying you can't deploy troops in the state of Oregon. And so that case will continue on and be litigated. And in all likelihood, that's a case that could go on for quite some time.
Yes.
We should also note this is not unusual. State of California had the same situation. They had National Guard deployed there. They also challenged in court, and it's a different situation. So I hate to compare the two, but in some ways it is similar. It went to the Ninth Circuit, and there are some limitations on what the troops can do and where they can be specifically to protect federal buildings. I won't get too deep into the weeds because, to be completely honest, it gets over my head at some point. But what we know about Oregon, which is again a uniquely different situation, is that ultimately this comes down to a decision from a federal judge here in Portland on whether or not to issue this temporary restraining order.
Okay, good perspective. Thank you so much for your time, Kyle. Appreciate it. And thank you so much for watching. This has been a special streaming coverage of the Oregon National Deployment in the city of Portland. Coming up at 4 o'clock today, we will have a live update from the federal courthouse on the outcome of today's hearing, any updates that may come along throughout the afternoon, and a live report from the ICE facility to check in on what is happening there. We'll see you then.